If you haven't noticed already or are new to the world of art history and analysis, aesthetics, whether they be architectural, industrial, sartorial, or music related, are often inspired by the zeitgeist in which they arose. Take the visual hallmarks of the 1980s in the West: gaudy maximalism and the Memphis interior design style. Both can be attributed to the greed is good ethos of the era, because the dominant perception was that the economy was booming and life was good. This perception inspired people to decorate themselves or their homes in a more maximalist manner. Meanwhile, people became more aware of the excess of the 80s and the 90s, which shifted the aesthetics. More industrial designers and artists embraced minimalism, while regular people branched out into different modes of expression. The biggest example being Gen X teens and young adults in Seattle, who shunned consumerism and embraced a sartorial aesthetic more rooted in the working class. But the 90s had a lot more than minimalism and a dislike for the 80s going for it. It's specifically remembered as a time of prosperity and world peace, and many people at the time believed that things would only get better as societies and cultures increasingly became interconnected due to free trade and technology. This attitude was reflected in the aesthetic sensibilities of the decade as well, from things like world-inspired clothing and cafes to futuristic music videos. Hi, and welcome to Vanishdied. I'm Jayana. This is part 1 of a 2-part series on globalism and its aesthetics throughout the 90s. As for why I'm splitting this into 2 parts, it's really simple. I don't feel like editing a really long script today, I'm sorry. This is also why I'm dressed like this. This is the most multicultural garb I had in my whole closet, so. As far as globalization goes, there are many definitions that theorists can't seem to agree upon. So I'm going with Manfred B. Steger's concise definition of globalization as the, quote, expansion and intensification of social relations and consciousness across world time and world space. Most people who discuss and critique globalization will point out that this phenomenon really isn't unique to the late 20th century. There have always been interactions between people and cultures spread across vast swaths of geography, and technological advancement, such as in the form of the telegraph and the radio or trains, has always been a catalyst for these unwanted or unwanted interactions. One difference between the globalization of the 90s and the previous examples is the obvious jump in technology that had taken place. Like, sure, telegraphs are cool, but the internet was and remains unmatched in its ability to connect people in totally different parts of the world. Another difference is the concept of Western democracy. For a good 45 years in the 20th century, the world was living under the shadow of the Cold War, the standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States that involved nuclear weapons and mutually assured death for everybody involved. Things finally changed between the late 80s and early 90s. The Soviet Union dissolved officially in 1991, but it was the fall of the Berlin Wall as a part of the revolutions of 1989 that really got the ball rolling. The fall of the Soviet Union left the US as the world's primary superpower and led scholar Francis Fukuyama to declare the end of history. Basically, to Fukuyama, Western liberal democracy and capitalism were the end-all be-all of humanity's ideological evolution, and things really couldn't get any better than that afterward. This concept was heavily criticized at the time and remains kind of an odd and Western-centric view in general. Nonetheless, there was a restlessness in the air as the West looked towards a future without its big bad. Then came the Gulf War, which, thanks to advancements in media technology, was broadcasted directly into the living rooms of average people, allowing the US government to show off the weapons they had developed during the Cold War in front of a live audience of millions. The spectacle of this digital war, the, quote, targets, flashes, bullseye missiles taking off, homing in, exploding, all in the bluish glimmer of the video light, helped the US government and military rid themselves of so-called Vietnam syndrome, and helped the Western world feel like they were doing pretty okay. While the 1980s tends to suck up all the attention for being a prosperous time thanks to its opulence, Weisberg notes that, despite the recession at the beginning of the decade, the United States poverty rate was lower throughout the Clinton-led 90s than it was the Reagan-led 80s. There was also talk of a new economy in which white-collar service-based jobs replaced traditional blue-collar industries. Generation X, despite being lambasted by those before them as aimless, passive, and, quote, overly sensitive at best and lazy at worst, quickly adapted to the loss of factory jobs to outsourcing, since they were the most college-educated generation in U.S. history up to that point. Combined with a falling incarceration rate, there was the general idea that things were getting better in one way or another across the board. This sense of prosperity, technological progress, and interconnectedness did wonders to boost what scholar Steger calls the global imaginary, or people's growing consciousness of belonging to a global community. There was a fear, or hope if you were someone like Fukuyama, that globalization would lead to sameness and the endless spread of Western, specifically American, culture. Meanwhile, others saw the internet as the harbinger of a homogenized technoculture. As we know many years later, these fears or hopes did not materialize, and we experienced more of a hybridization between cultures than any total takeover, which is what brings us to the topic of global aesthetics. This next section comes courtesy of Evan Collins, Froyo Tam, and the rest of the curators and archivists over at the Consumer Aesthetics Research Institute. Without their work, this video would have never been made. For aesthetics that arose from the global imaginary, there are two camps they fall into: the global village aesthetics and the aesthetics of eternity, which again will be covered in the next part. The global village aesthetic in this video is anything inspired by the interconnectivity that arose because of technology. These, as you will see, focus more on multiculturalism, cultural exchange, and notions of world peace rather than focusing on the actual technology, as the next section of aesthetics do. Furthermore, the global village aesthetics can be split into two further subsections, non-Western and Western. Also note that Kari goes more in depth on the individual aesthetics, but for ease of analysis, I'm grouping them all together. One important thing to note here is that Gen X, the group of people who are going into the workforce and thus being marketed to the most, were notable at the time for being more likely to hold off on careers to travel, specifically to non-Western countries like Thailand and India and Tanzania, unlike previous generations who would just go to Europe. David Gross and Sophronia Scott, who wrote the Time article that defined Gen X, notes that this was a way for them to differentiate themselves from the, quote, self-centered, fickle, and impractical baby boomers by gaining cultural enrichment through, quote, escaping from Western society, rather than seeking further refinement to smooth their entry into society. Gen X was also viewed as being more open to different cultures thanks to their supposed lack of an original youth culture. That last claim would be disproven in the next few years as things such as grunge and the Riot Grrrl movement appeared, but the point is that Gen X was super into multiculturalism, which was another reason that the global village aesthetics were a big deal back then. With these aesthetics, most of the motifs were pulled from different time periods: hieroglyphics, maps, compasses, simplistic humanoid figures, etc. For the non-Western aesthetics, Western conceptions of the East, aka Orientalism, are used most often, but there are some hints of indigenous and African cultural motifs. So before diving any deeper, let's address the most obvious thing: a lot of this was cultural appropriation. I think we've heard this term enough times to know why it's bad, but an example from the 90s that comes to mind is within the world music genre, which as a whole just denotes any non-Western music style. The French band Deep Forest, who are often dubbed ethnic electronica, had a song called Sweet Lullaby that used a recording of a woman from the Solomon Islands without permission from the woman or the ethnomusicologist who originally recorded it in the 1970s. Deep Forest claimed their goal was a general desire to foster, quote, the respect of this tradition which humanity should cherish as a treasure which marries world harmony. Neither the ethnomusicologist nor the woman whose voice was used in the song received a penny from it, even though it went on to become a hit. It's worth mentioning that throughout history, textiles and art were often the first thing to be exchanged when new trade routes became available. But the cultural exchange that occurred through the Silk Road or even in the Roman Empire happened in a pre-white supremacist context and power dynamic that differed from the 90s, when a new sort of Western imperialism had begun thanks to outsourcing to third world countries and otherwise uninhibited neoliberal free trade. As Lucy Mulvaney mentions, cultural appropriation cannot be divorced from the prevalent issues of institutional racism and discrimination. You cannot play dress up with the reality of other people's lives or what they consider sacred. Deep Forest's problem with Sweet Lullaby is also an example of the salvage paradigm. The term is used by anthropologists to critique the idea that non-Western people are too weak to preserve their own cultures from the sweeping changes of modernism. Adding to that, Nicole Bennett, in her critique of Jean-Paul Gaultier's 1994 Global Village Chic collection, uses the term to refer to the idea that most non-Western people are perceived as marginal to the advancing world system, thus rendering their aesthetics as of the past, rather than able to continue fluidly into the present and the future. All of the non-Western global village aesthetics reinforce the idea that what is non-Western is non-normative and of the past, while that which is Western is normal and current. Here, Western culture is considered the default, and a symbol of modernity and advancing civilization, while non-Western cultures are exotified for consumption and rendered endangered relics, even though actual people were still taking part in the visual aesthetics of their cultures. As David Burns said of the label World Music in a 1999 New York Times article, it's a none too subtle way of reasserting the hegemony of Western pop culture. It ghettoizes most of the world's music. A bold and audacious move, white man. Despite the professed good intentions behind these displays of multiculturalism, they did little to improve perceptions of the cultures they displayed, and instead reinforced them as pre-modern and marginal. Bell Hooks in 1992 wrote that constructions of otherness such as these just reinforce inequality and social hierarchy, saying that, quote, "the hope is that the desires for the primitive or fantasies about the other can perpetuate, quote, the idea that there is pleasure to be found in the acknowledgement and enjoyment of racial difference, without the effort to challenge these structures." Basically, people felt like it was enough to feel enriched by this exposure to different cultures and never felt the need to question Western hegemony or white supremacy that caused these cultural displays to be less prominent in the first place. Which brings us to the graphic and interior design aesthetics, specifically Global Village Coffeehouse. This aesthetic also played up the idea of the non-Western as pre-modern by focusing on natural motifs and primitive imagery, with its amalgamation of various ancient cultures from Egyptian to Aztec and in some places Greek. Interestingly, as Eben Collins, who coined the term, points out, the Global Village Coffeehouse aesthetic also contains a lot of colonialist imagery a la the Age of Discovery, through things such as, quote, Mercator globes, compasses, rigged ships, maritime wheels, and heraldic moons and suns. Juxtaposed with the non-Western motifs, including these symbols is startling, since it could be a nod to the perceived evolution of Western society, and thus an indirect reference to the snuffing out of these non-Western cultures. Then we have the Western global aesthetics, all of which are reflections of a Western past. Eben Collins identifies about 3 which were still in vogue around the 90s, neoclassical postmodernism, Renaissance revival, and 2 others that are based on the Mediterranean and the Age of Discovery. Neoclassical aesthetics, which are based on Greco-Roman art and architecture, have always been popular and remain the most popular style of architecture throughout the Western world. Greek philosophy and the Roman Empire are considered the foundations of Western civilization by many. Today, you most often see this architectural style in things like museums or state buildings because of the ethos of stateliness or officiality in parts. Neoclassical postmodernism, as presented by Eben Collins, popped up in the late 1970s. The reason it came about again in this era seems to be a reaction to the modernist architectural trend after World War II, which architect Donald McMorran referred to as a, quote, dictatorship of taste. I'll get into the exact implications of this in the next part, I believe, but just know it's an early example of that whole weird reject modernity, embrace tradition thing that conservative incels like to use. At any rate, this became popular again when a conservative movement was building in the late 70s, went through the 80s when the conservative movement was at its peak, and lasted until at least the early 90s in this iteration. As you can see, some of these pictures are pretty ironic. You have these relics of the supposed Great Western past juxtaposed with these hyper-consumerist images of like gift shops. Again, the Roman Empire was proto-globalist. It included many cultures, created roads for travel and communication, and helped lead to a relatively brief period of peace which enabled population growth, even more trade, and the eventual spread of Christianity, which again makes it an important Western cornerstone. Neoclassical POMO likely isn't a direct response to 90s multiculturalism considering how it predates the 90s, but it would be a mistake, I feel, to ignore the irony of these existing at the same time. Yes, all of these aesthetics are alike in that they reference a bygone temporal space, but ancient Greco-Roman culture and aesthetics have been used to delegitimize those of non-Western cultures since the late 18th and 19th centuries. Misreadings of Greco-Roman concepts of the other, after all, they did not know whiteness, and anyone who wasn't Greek or Roman was considered a barbarian, informed a lot of race theory during and after the Age of Discovery. This would also shape Western constructions of modernity, in that race theorists justify colonialism and slavery as a good thing because it helps spread, quote, superior Western values to people deemed of a lower status. Remember these concepts because they're important to what's coming up. But this is where I'll be splitting the video. The next part, of course, will cover the aesthetics that are more aligned with the technological advancements of the 90s, most notably Y2K. Until then, feel free to like this video, and be sure to hit the subscribe button to be notified when the next part drops. I also make short-form videos on TikTok about women in fashion, arts, and culture, so feel free to follow me there as well if you like. I also have a Twitter, where I reblog and post fun things. So, till next time, thanks for watching.